Well, as you said, he's trying to get that clean sweep, 4 major television titles this year. That won't be the only thing on the calendar, at least in coming years, as during the finals, the chairman of World Senior Darts was talking to the television crew and mentioned that there's talk of branching out with events outside of the UK. What do you see as the next steps for the World Seniors Tour?
Yeah, that was interesting to listen to on the broadcast. Jason Francis, in between the semi-finals and the final, one of the big things he said was branching outside of the UK. And if this is to be a World Seniors Tour, you can't just have every event in the UK. You need to also look elsewhere. And I wonder where those next markets are going to be. Are they going to be looking at the Netherlands, Germany, or further afield, maybe to America or Canada or even Asia? But the plan seems to be to have some seniors events put on there and working with other organisations, from what I can make out, to run essentially qualifiers to get into their TV events. So next year's World Championship, we could see qualifiers come from events held outside the UK, perhaps a Dutch qualifier or an American qualifier, and build it from there. But we are only in the second year of the World Seniors, and already you can see how much they've achieved. And as we mentioned on last week's show, I was there for the Thursday and Friday for the 4 first round sessions on my last trip to the Circus Tavern. That was for the World Masters in 2019 under the BDO, an event which I really enjoyed covering. But from an organiser's point of view, it proved to be the last one. That the crowds were very poor. It was an event which at the time you feared for going forwards, even before what happened with the World Championships the year after. But looking at this event, I think the organisers, they are going to be pleased. And okay, the Thursday afternoon and evening, it wasn't a sellout, but you could see with each session going forward, there was more fans turning up. And on the Friday night, obviously, you've got Phil Taylor, Glenn Durrant. They shifted a lot of tickets and it was packed on that Friday night. And I think the World Seniors, they have got a good product on their hands. And this year, as we've mentioned, 4 events on TV. Some might say that's a little oversaturation. But on the other hand, if they want to grow the tour, the events this year on the floor, you want to get more players playing, grow that side of it, then they can't just be playing for one TV tournament a year. Otherwise, they might be looking elsewhere. So I think another thing as well is going to be the field for these events. How long the appeal of seeing players that get automatic invites each year but are not as competitive as others is, unfortunately for me, he is still the GOAT, but a sub 70 average from Coast Dompe, even he knows an invite to next year's World Championship, that is going to be up in the air right now. But we need to get that campaign started as soon as we can. But the field, it does need to evolve. There's going to be players dropping off the PDC tour in their 50s already, or who are going to turn 50 over the next few years, and you could see them having a go. Players chancing their arm. We just had Mark Dumbridge, who turned 50 last month. He got an invite. We could see John Henderson, Colin Lloyd, players like that who are close to the magic number. And I think overall how the field is put together for these events, how they branch out to other countries, get more countries involved, they're going to be, I think, the 2 most important factors for how this seniors progresses from here going onwards.
Yeah, and starting on that point you said about changing up the field, I do agree, but there should always be a spot for at least a few true legends, because those are the players who are going to sell the tickets. And yeah, some of them are still up to scratch. Phil Taylor, he might not be the Phil Taylor of old, but he still plays at a level that is certainly watchable and certainly competitive. Some of the other older players, especially even older than Taylor, might not be, but they do get the bums in seats, and getting bums in seats is important, and because it's also going to get eyeballs on the television, and eyeballs on the television will bring in money. So it is finding a neat balance. I think last year the balance was a little out of whack, especially with only 24 spots, but with a couple of those players not playing this year. John Lowe, obviously, it was a one-off for him last year. So a couple of the less competitive players stepping aside this year led to, I think, an overall more competitive field and more players who were up to scratch. And I think that's where you want to be going forward, having 4 or so true legends who are there because they earned it over their career, but most of the field being players up to scratch. I think, as I said, they did a good job of it this year. As far as where they go from here, one thing I didn't say in the introduction to the question, they also mentioned that they don't want the tour to get like PDC level or WDF level, where there's an event every weekend. And that makes sense because these players have already done that. They're playing the senior tour because they don't want to be traveling the country, traveling the world if they go international, like they're saying they're going to, every week playing events. They these are players who, especially some of these legends, are playing more exhibitions than anything else. But it's still nice to have a tournament to play, to get that competitive spirit going against their peers, and maybe win a little money on the side. So keeping it to about 10 weekends a year makes sense. And that would be, there's 4 televised events. That leaves 6 weekends to have other events over the course of the year. And you can put together a pretty nice tour. Whether that's all in the UK or not, well, that's where the next step goes. And I do like the idea that there will be senior events in other places. Now, right now, if you look at, especially at the top level, there were more darts. Darts was bigger in the UK than anywhere else for a very long time. Yes, there were, if you look at the early lakesides, there were players from particularly Sweden and some of the other Nordic countries, and occasionally some players from mainland Europe. But there wasn't as much darts. The darts boom took off in the Netherlands with Raymond van Barneveld in the 90s, and it took off even later in some other countries. And that will limit the number of available senior players who are up to scratch in all those countries. But having some events, even if they're just regional, to determine some regional qualifiers, I think is a good thing. And there are players missing from this, some names that darts fans would recognize that maybe are still up to scratch and are good enough to play in this tournament. If there were events going on in other places in the world, maybe some of them would qualify through. Obviously, Australia has always had a very good dart scene. The US and Canada were very involved in, still is, but less so playing in the UK now, but has always had a lot of players playing. So there is room for these events to take place and maybe to determine some qualifiers for the World Seniors and other major events going forward. I don't think it's realistic to expect that most of the senior players will travel halfway around the world. Maybe they'll travel to Europe, but not halfway around the world for just regular senior tour events. But that's okay. And that's also what they are expecting. If they're trying to find people who are willing to organize the events around the world under the auspices of World Senior Darts, then that's perfect. And they don't have to expect or even encourage all the top players to go. Maybe some of them will. And there is something to be said, especially if you're able to get some of the flag bearers to go. Going back 15 years ago, Robert Thornton did travel around the world. He played in events in Australia and the US when he first came over to the PDC, and he wasn't the only one. But it's less expected that they would do it now. I like that idea. I like what the World Senior Tour is doing. I think it's coming together well. I know I had a lot of criticisms and questions about it last year. I still have some question marks about where it goes from here, but it seems like they have found or are finding that right balance that will make this tour work without it being complete overkill and without it just becoming just a one-off exhibition like, well, I'll admit I thought it would become.